Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. My name is Emily G., and I am Senior Vice President for Inclusive Growth here at CAP. As multi-year omnibus legislation, the Farm Bill has historically been supported by a diverse coalition of stakeholders with interests in agriculture and food programs. That coalition brings together advocates for the sustainability of farming and for rural communities, for better and healthier food and nutrition, for the agriculture industry, and for conservation. The Farm Bill is also one of the largest legislative vehicles for tackling poverty. But the politics of that coalition may be changing. And that's because Congress included some of the agricultural subsidies typically renewed in the Farm Bill as part of this year's reconciliation package. That so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act also dealt an enormous blow to food assistance programs, slashing SNAP by $187 billion over the next decade. Those cuts fall upon earlier Trump administration freezes on funding for programs that support Americans' basic needs and local and regional food systems, for example, connecting local farmers to school districts to provide healthy food. So, what comes next? Might fractures in this Farm Bill coalition present an opportunity to re-examine how policy puts a thumb on the scale in food production? How can policymakers support the sustainability of small family farms and rural communities amid a push for high-yield production or growing concentration? And can we bring into concert goals for agriculture policy with those for health and for climate? Today, we are honored to host two people to discuss those questions about the future of the Farm Bill and how policymaking should address environmental sustainability, food systems, and the prosperity of America's agricultural communities. First, journalist Michael Grunwald is a New York Times opinion contributor and was formerly at the Washington Post, Time, and Politico, where he earned awards for his investigative reporting. He is the author of multiple books, including his most recent, titled We Are Eating the Earth, which is a deep dive into the consequences that our food systems pose for the climate and the future of agriculture itself. The book follows advocate Tim Searchinger in his efforts to shed light on the enormous demand for land posed by agriculture, and it critically examines the promise of new technologies and policy interventions to boost yields and reduce environmental harm. We are also delighted to welcome Senator Heidi Heitkamp, who represented North Dakota from 2013 to 2019. Her career exemplifies a life of public service, spanning legal work at the Environmental Protection Agency, to serving as Attorney General in North Dakota, to serving here in Washington. She is the founder and chair of the One Country Project, an organization focused on addressing the needs and concerns of rural America. She is also a co-chair of America's Rural Future, a solutions-focused bipartisan commission of the Brookings Institution and the American Enterprise Institute. The conversation will be moderated by Mark Haggerty, a senior fellow here at CAP for Energy and Environment. Thank you so much for kicking off this important discussion.
I'm very excited to have Heidi and Mike with us. They have graciously agreed to be very casual here, so I will refer to them that way. That in no way should downplay their experience and status. But I want to start by framing this a little bit. It appears that the farm economy in the United States is broken, as evidenced by looming bankruptcies, further consolidation of major corporations. It's also not working for the rural economy. It should be apparent that what's good for agriculture is not necessarily good for the rural communities where agriculture is situated. And I want to start with Heidi. North Dakota has a lot of soybean growers. And can you just give us a little sense of what's happening right now and how it gives us a window into the role that policy plays in the farm economy and why it might not be working so well right now for this moment?
Just kind of calibrate this. When you think about kind of the land in North Dakota and what it's utilized for, if you went west of Valley City, which is about 60 miles to the west of Fargo, back when I was very young, you would never see corn. You would never see soybeans. You would only see wheat. You might see some canola, maybe some sunflowers. That has all changed as genetics and as technology has made that growth in the soybean and corn market possible in a lot of places in North Dakota. So just to give you a sense of what used to be a very diversified farm economy in terms of what they grew has become corn and soybeans. It has been heavily dependent on two crops. Those two crops are heavily dependent on markets, which are heavily dependent on exports, and making sure that we can, in fact, move especially soybeans into China. China was the largest market for soybeans in North Dakota. I think about a third of our soybeans were actually sent to China at one point. That market, China's not buying one soybean from the United States today. You put on top of that the corn market, which is also struggling because the ethanol that we produce in this country is in excess of what we can utilize, so we have to rely on export markets. And at the same time, the first Trump administration, which led to tariffs that hurt these markets that we spent a lot of money as taxpayers, by the way, spent a lot of money as taxpayers basically growing those markets diminished. And what China did is China decided that you could double crop in Brazil, and if you built ports in Brazil, you could guarantee a friendlier market for your ag commodities. And so we've been clawing back that market for 4 years. We've seen better prices during the Biden years, not perfect prices, but better prices. Now we're seeing the double whammy of very low commodity prices, high yields coming in agriculture. We have record yields on the horizon. So a surplus crop in a diminished market. And so I think you've already queued up the fact that we are now seeing farm bankruptcies at record amounts. Or what we're seeing is the aging of farmers in this country. They don't have some son or daughter who wants to farm behind them. And so they're saying, why am I struggling? I've got this huge asset, which is this land. I could lose this land if I continue to farm, or I could sell this land. And the land sales are what I think is kind of been underreported in terms of what's happening out there. More and more land going on the market. Question is it going to sustain a high value? We've seen record values in Iowa. I mean, outrageous not even in developed land, but just in farmland. My husband grew up on a family farm. My dad I grew up in a town of 90 people, so we help family farmers, right? My dad delivered bulk oil and gas, but my husband was a family farmer, grew up on a family farm. I got home and, obviously his parents, when they passed the farmland onto the kids, and trust companies reaching out, offering money to purchase land. And so this is a lot of very concerning, and I think there's always this dichotomy of, the small farmers are going to struggle, and the large farmers, they don't have to struggle. They've got economies of scale. That's not true. Some of the farms that are going to fail are maybe some of the biggest farms in North Dakota, and this isn't unique to North Dakota. It's happening all across, especially corn and soybean belt, and rice. You've read a lot of stories probably about Arkansas. Farmers in Arkansas who grow rice don't have one place that they can sell it.
And so one of the things that may happen here is we could see payments from the administration to try to keep some of these farmers afloat. That whole system of payments to farmers has been pretty controversial. Mike, you wrote recently in the New York Times that it was time to stop pandering to farmers. Can you explain a little more about what you mean by that?
I think your language is a little more colorful than that, wasn't it?
Certainly the original headline was a little more was toned down. Look, I do. I just wrote a policy book, and I'm in front of policy people, and so you guys won't like me oversimplifying like this. But I think American agriculture policy. It mostly sucks. It is mostly consists of sucking up to pretty well-off farmers. There are probably about 1 million full-time farmers in the country, and it's basically giving them a lot of money and a lot of perks and mandating biofuels that that put more money in their pocket, and at the same time, after all those carrots, essentially a guarantee of very few sticks, very little environmental regulation. Farmers are exempted from all kinds of regulations. I love the one that even the regulation that says how many hours truck drivers can drive without taking a break. There's an exemption for agricultural deliveries. So I think when you talk about the opportunity right now. And it's it's a little tough because there used to be, like, for Republicans it's at least working, right? They're doing awesome. It's terrible policy, but they're doing awesome in rural America, and they're shoveling a lot of money to farmers who are part of interest groups that are very supportive of Republicans. I always point out, I love asking this. Does anybody know what the Farm Bureau has a manifesto? And anybody want to guess what their number one priority is? I guess. Sorry? That is number one. It's a man and woman. So they're playing to the crowd. And then there used to be this grand bargain where that Emily referred to, where the farmers will get their subsidies, but at least there will be food stamps fully funded, and that was an incentive for particularly urban Democrats to support farm bills as well, and that deal is off. So this is an opportunity, and there are a lot of directions that certainly Democrats could go. I think of all the, there are a lot of options, and we can discuss them. In general, I would say it would maybe be focusing less on those 1 million growers and more on the 350 million eaters. And if you had to pick one issue that people care a lot about when it comes to food and ag these days, I've heard that the price of food is something people care about, that people were kind of upset that the last president, food prices went up. And if you look at some of the policies that are out there today, tariffs make food more expensive. Cracking down on migrant labor makes food more expensive. Biofuel mandates make food more expensive. The sugar program and a lot of other federal programs make food more expensive. We'll get to this later, but I would also point out that the sort of a focus on twee organic farms and regenerative farms, using beef tallow instead of seed oils. Those are also things that can make food more expensive. But in general, I think there's an opportunity to change priorities. From right now, I think you'd have to say the priority is sending big checks to guys so they can buy a new F-150 every year. And now there's an opportunity for new priorities, whether it's attaching that money to the things that people care about, whether it's clean water, climate progress, biodiversity, and other things you can do to improve your land, or whether it's changing that money so that it no longer goes to just the biggest farmers who farm the 5 commodities that get the biggest subsidies, as well as the most vertically integrated meat companies. There are a lot of ways you can do it. I'm sure we'll get into some of these environmental issues, but we're going to need to make a lot more food with a lot less land and a lot fewer emissions. And I think we could, for Democrats and just progressives general who care about environmental issues, about as well as feeding the world, this idea that you can move policy to make more food with less of a mess is, I think, a kind of attractive new approach.
So, Heidi.
I just want to, as somebody who actually sponsored a bill that exempted ag haulers, be a little
and
defensive
oil and
here.
gas,
So you're taking a load of potatoes, and you're now supposed to stop, and they need to get where they're going, or they won't be good by the time they get there. So the idea is that there are reasons for some of these policies. It may have gone too far. It may have gone to total exemptions. But I just want to talk, maybe in response to this a little bit, which is one of the challenges that we have when it's them versus us, when we don't understand why there is frustration. I'll take you waters of the United States. I used to put, I sponsored a bill to try and redefine what was waters of the United States as opposed to going to the court. It's hugely controversial in rural America. And I used to put up, North Dakota has the flyover prairie pothole regions. It's a huge habitat. We all know that 1 acre or less is actually really good for ducks and geese, which southern, hunters really like. But if you look at it, you'll have farmers who may have 20 of these structures on a section of land, and they're going to ask, EPA is going to have jurisdiction? And I once put up one of those signs, and I said to somebody who was arguing that that was all waters of the United States, didn't need to be connected at the surface. I said, tell me, which one of these structures, these wetlands, are waters of the United States? And they said, we don't know. And I said, that's the problem. And so I think it's really important. It's easy to demonize when you kind of say it as in simple, and you did caveat it, but it's easy to demonize the frustration that farmers have. But there are real concerns that they have about overreach, real concerns that they have about how they're going to make a living in a highly regulated environment. Now, they are also heavily subsidized.
And so the overreach doesn't extend to their mailboxes. They're that concerned.
So I think this is a great line that we want to keep pulling on throughout this conversation. Like, where's the middle ground between pandering and attacking? And Heidi, I want to get your take on the opportunity, if this is an opportunity. Are we going to see a farm bill? And if we're not going to see a farm bill, where do you think the policy discussion goes next?
I mean, everybody in this room is really sophisticated. You've watched this. You're familiar with the, McGovern-Dole compromise that a lot of farmers always want to unwind. And people like me would say, good luck with that. Because, I think at one point I did the calculation, less than 15% of the members of the House of Representatives have farmers in their district. And I may have exaggerated that a little bit, but it's a very small number. So why would they care what's happening? They care about the Farm Bill because it's where nutrition happens, where food assistance happens, where assistance for the local food pantry happens. And that trust has built a Farm Bill. You can agree or not agree with what's happened over the last, since the 30s, with the growth of the Farm Bill, the transitions in the Farm Bill, but that trust has built stability for the Farm Bill. That trust has now been broken. I don't think there's any doubt about it. And you can look at that as, okay, now we're going to go to our corners and not have a conversation. We're just wait until we're in charge, because then we're going to sock it to Big Ag. Or you can say, this is an opportunity to actually have stability. Stability in farm policy that will bring in a more stable set of regulations, a more stable kind of farm bill that reflects more progressive values. And so to me, right now, and I applaud CAP for having these conversations, right now is a way to back up, not scream at the whatever, the powers that be for having done this, but to say, the worm will turn, and there is now going to be opportunity for us to do some really creative things and have a broader conversation about what the Farm Bill should look like.
So let's pull on one of these places we're going to need to have these conversations. Agriculture is a third of our climate emissions, and it gets a lot less research dollars, a lot less kind of policy and innovation conversation around it. You just spent 6 years, I think I heard, writing a book about this. Can you tell us what you think needs to happen to make agriculture more climate friendly?
Yeah, and I'll go back a little bit to your earlier question too about sort of the line between demonizing and pandering, because I think there's this sort of weird. The senator knows about this, that in Washington there's this kind of weird sort of. I find it kind of like this sort of simultaneous sort of romanticizing and I feel like kind of condescending to farm country, where it's sort of like, our hardworking farmers, the heartland of America. And my experience with farmers is that they're like excellent businessmen, incredibly competent people, very smart, and also like, people who have been pandered to, a little entitled when it comes to government policy. And I think there needs to be a sort of more mature approach to farmers, where they, this sort of acknowledgement that they're providing an incredibly important service, that the 0.1% of them make it possible for the 99.9% of us to be, think tankers and write books critical of agriculture and, and all, be doctors and influencers and everything else. And one of those issues where I think it's like, hey, but there are responsibilities as well. And farmers talk a lot about how they want to be good stewards of the land, and many of them really are, certainly make an effort. But I think you have to say that collectively they're stewarding a mess. As you mentioned, ag is now a third of the climate problem. It uses 70% of our fresh water. It is by far the leading driver of deforestation, of biodiversity loss, of water pollution, of water shortages, and obviously farmers are not always been a constructive, partner in the politics of this stuff. But look, my message is that. The we are eating the earth thing is that, most of us, we don't think about it. We take the plane, we look out the window, we see all the rectangles and circles, and we say, oh, wow, there's a lot of ag out there. But it turns out like there is a lot of ag out there, right? Cities and suburbs are about 1% of the earth's land. Farms and pastures are like 40%. And that is at the heart of all of these environmental problems. And so I think the opportunity is to say like, hey, you're creating a lot of emissions with your crop dusters and diesel tractors and nitrogen fertilizers and, burping cows, yes. But the main source of these emissions is agricultural expansion. And we need to come up with a way that, that farmers can help to make agriculture more intensive, less extensive, and just make less of a mess. And I think, and climate is a part of that, whether or not they want to hear it. But most of them are at least willing to have the conversation. They'll acknowledge that the, shit's changing, even if they're not willing to necessarily say that, it's man-made climate change.
A couple years ago, the Bipartisan Policy Center initiated a project on natural climate solutions. And so Saxby Chambliss and I co-chaired it. And we started from a premise that it has to be practical. By that, I mean politically practical, which means it's got to be something that can, in fact, happen. About a third of what we recommended in the final report ended up in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so when we talk about kind of the creep of the Farm Bill going to other pieces of legislation, that's a classic example. EQIP, some of the expansion for rotational grazing, taking a look at carbon credits, a lot of that found its way into the Inflation Reduction Act. And so the Democrats steadfastly said, we are not going to compromise the Inflation Reduction Act into the new Farm Bill. We're going to take all of that money and we want to build the baseline for conservation. Okay, that totality, that, we got to have it all. Now you're not getting any of it. And so I think it's critically important to think about this as yes, I think you queued it up right. I mean, there's carrots and there's sticks, and there haven't been a lot of sticks. That's because back in the day when, you had freedom to farm and there was a lot of pressure on farmers in terms of wetland easements. I mean, I can go through the whole history of, what farmers would say was an incursion or basically an overreach into their private property rights. Although, a lot of that was dependent on whether you got a payment, right? So I'm not naive about this. But my point in saying all of this is that there are ways to build relationships with American agriculture that doesn't alienate it. And you've got to be incredibly careful with language. And what I mean by that is, and you're here, you have a perspective, but that language, if we were sitting at the Farm Bureau meeting or the Farmers Union meeting even in North Dakota, we would have angry farmers out here who would say, you don't live my life. I have all of these assets that are embedded and that I'm basically carrying. I'm now in a negative cash flow position, and you're telling me that I'm greedy and that I'm not taking care of my business. And so I think there's ways to have conversations about how agriculture can participate in the climate debate without alienating farmers. I think there's a lot of really good people out there who want to know. And by the way, you know what they want? They want to make a living. And if you told them you can make a living by doing this, I just tell one story. It's a story, there was a drought up in central part of North Dakota in the Beulah area. You wouldn't know where that is, but it was pretty bad out there. And there was one rancher out there who had routinely done rotational grazing and had done a lot of used EQIP funds. He was like the model, the conservation model. And when the drought came, all these other cattlemen had to sell their herds, and he was still grazing. And guess what? They looked, as we said, they looked over the fence and said, what are you doing? And so I think it is about how do you bring agricultural along? Because if we simply get into the now we're in power and we're going to stick it to you kind of mentality, we won't get any further along in resolving this participation that we need agriculture to participate clearly in the climate discussion if we're going to make progress for the reasons that you heard here. But language matters, and profitability, showing profitability at various levels of federal policy will be critical.
I mean, Trump's going to take care of all of them, though. He's going to cut them a big check like he did last time.
And I just want to say this, that is not going to satisfy them. They saw what happened. They saw what happened to the markets last time, and they clawed their way back, and now they're seeing that there is a diminishment, a permanent diminishment of their ability to make money. And you add to that, and I want to just make this point. We don't talk enough about the steel and aluminum tariffs. Agriculture is a heavy utilization on farm equipment. You see what's happening with Deere. You see what's happening with the cost of farm equipment. You see what's happening with the cost of technology. Some of the stuff you're for, embedding more technology, that's highly concentrated and very expensive conversions.
I just quickly point out, because we totally, I agree about, I think the way you're framing the debate is exactly right. I just want to point out that there is an opportunity cost to this, I call it pandering. That's not a nice word, I know. But this idea that these are people who are never going to support you. It's like they're never going to support the next Democratic candidate from North Dakota. And as you've talked about beautifully, there are ways to support rural communities that go way beyond just supporting this very small subset of the richest guy in the rural community, that I think is a much bigger political opportunity than somehow trying to thread this needle of satisfying these very difficult to satisfy sector.
I do want to introduce that topic and then come back around to common ground at the end. So Heidi, the ERS publishes farm typology reports, and of the 400-ish farm-dependent counties in the country, 2/3 of them are losing population. And so I think we should be clear now that what's good for farmers isn't always good for the communities where they live and where their kids go to school. You are part of a new rural commission that Brookings and AEI are standing up. You're co-chair with Chris Sununu. Can you just tell us a little bit about what rural communities actually need? And maybe if we're not going to have a farm bill, do we need a rural bill?
okay, this may sound too Pollyannish, but rural communities need hope. Rural communities need hope. And I just want to introduce Tony Pippa. He's in the back. He's the one who convinced me to do this. At the University of Chicago, I did a project called Bridging the Divide, where we brought in kids from urban schools and kids from rural schools, and we hosted everyone and had a conversation about the commonality, whether it was housing, whether it was healthcare. Politically, we have divided rural and urban because it worked politically. But if you ask a farmer what he wants, it would be no different than what a cab driver in New York wants. They want good education, good health care. They want their kids to have opportunities. They want to be safe. They want a peaceful world. I mean, so the idea behind this is that the desires and the wishes of rural America are not substantially different than Americans in any other part. But how you deliver those services is different. And we have been stuck in this rut. And to your point, kind of marching down, check, 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 instead of why are we doing it this way? How should we rethink what we're doing? How should we rethink rural development? How should we rethink rural prosperity? How should we rethink bringing population or growing population in rural America? And so this effort is an effort to have those conversations and not have it dictated by think tanks or by policymakers, but actually sit down with people who are doing really creative, innovative things right now in America, in rural America. And so we're going to be doing, Tony, 8 regional meetings. The first one is in North Dakota. No big surprise there. But I'm really excited for this project because we're going to be talking about rural healthcare. We're going to be talking about rural energy and energy development because about a third of all rural counties in America don't get their money strictly from agriculture or majorly from agriculture. They get it from extraction of minerals. And so there's land utilization out there that we haven't really talked about in a kind of broader context. And so we're really excited about this project. It's going to be a 2-year project with a report at the end. And we are going to be out and about and rethinking rural policy and want to invite all of you as policymakers, as people who are in this room, to participate with us. I think, Tony, our first kind of symposium, we're doing kind of the think tank work and then the regional work. It's going to be, 2 weeks from now? Yeah, what's the date? 25th of September. You can join us virtually, but you'll get a sense of what that is and just check out our website. So I'm very excited about this because as somebody who cares about rural America, I told you I grew up in a town of 90 people. When my parents moved there to Matador, because they both moved off the family farm, there was a pharmacy in Matador. There was a grocery store in Matador. There was a bowling lane in Matador. None of those things are in Matador anymore. And so you have to accommodate these kinds of changes. And I used to tell people, I had a virtual test on whether we could keep population in rural America. It's probably naive today, but I called it the next Netflix test. Could you stream Netflix? And if you couldn't, then you were going to fail as a community. But there are a lot of primary sector. We don't talk enough about manufacturing in rural America. There are a lot of primary sector jobs that cannot find workers because we have created kind of not culture, but we have created a environment that doesn't sustain young families. You're pregnant, you're going to go 100 miles to deliver a baby. You're not going to have access to broadband. You aren't going to have access to education, the same education quality, healthcare. And so we need to talk about what's going to sustain and grow populations in rural America. Because concentration in urban America, is not the answer to our problem.
And in a lot of ways, agriculture was one of the first sectors to really go through a wave of automation and productivity gains that really ended the employment opportunity in a lot of rural communities. We see other sectors doing that now for a whole host of reasons. So I think this connection between agricultural policy and what's happening in rural America needs to be rethought. So I'm really pleased to watch you and Tony taking this on, and I'm excited to see where it goes. So I want to return now to this question of how do we find some common ground? Where is that opportunity between attacking and pandering to try to work together and use this opportunity that we have right now, potentially, if we're not going to have a farm bill, to make some progress and try to improve agriculture, try to improve food that people are eating, and try to improve the lives of people that live in rural communities. You can take this wherever you want to go.
Did you want me to start? Well, I think, everything that both of you have actually have suggested is that there's a huge opportunity to support rural America rather than trying to support a very narrow band of farmers. That's one place to start, right? And from a democratic perspective, it's farmers who are, it's the political insanity of doing the same thing and expecting different results. I think that certainly I'm not the rural development expert. She's sitting next to me, but I do feel like I know enough to say, like, not that. That what we're doing is not working, and that does create an opportunity. When we talk about specific food and farm policy, I don't know, since I've already pissed off 3/4 of the audience, let me piss off the other quarter. I do think, unfortunate that to the extent there is energy for doing something new, it is right now represented by kind of Bernie Sanders and Cory Booker and Shelley Pingree on the left, this kind of, but also to the same extent, Robert Kennedy and Joe Rogan on the right. This notion that, we need kind of more natural, chemical-free food and agriculture, that is, the kind of the Michael Pollan-pilled notion that we can have these sort of low-yield pastoral paradises, that I think is sort of ahistorical and environmentally really dangerous, would lead to eating a lot more of the earth. I think there's an opportunity for, whether it's agricultural research into these exciting technologies. I know research is not happening much these days either, but I wrote about my second half of the book is about solutions, and it's incredibly exciting, not just the kind of alternative protein, plant-based and cultivated meat that has now become the next political fight, right? Where, it used to be Obama mobiles and now it's Biden burgers, and we're just, rehashing these fights. But I'm talking about also alternative fertilizers, where we're gene editing microbes to feed, snatch nitrogen out of the air and feed it to crops, or alternative pesticides, where we're using bad word, but the mRNA technology behind the COVID vaccines to constipate potato beetles to death. There are these scientists at the University of Illinois who are literally reinventing photosynthesis, right? Which has been doing a pretty good job of maintaining life on this planet for the last 3 billion years, but turns out to be incredibly inefficient. And they are using artificial intelligence and modern genomics and big data to edit out some of those inefficiencies. And they believe they can increase crop yields 50% over the next 20 years. And this is the way we're going to kind of grow more food with less land and less mess. But right now, we've seen it happen in energy where, 20 years ago when I started writing about energy and climate, there was nothing. There was no progress. There were no alternatives to fossil fuels except for biofuels, which, turn out to be way worse for the climate. But they're just eating a Texas worth of the earth, while agriculture is eating 75 Texases. But anyway, today, we sort of can see the future with energy, even despite what's happening now. And we can see a future where there's, we try to electrify the global economy and run it on clean electricity. And it really matters whether it takes 20 or 30 or 40 years, but we can see that direction, and it's already happening. Food and ag, we're nowhere right now. Everybody's upset about all the climate progress that Trump is rolling back. Not in my world. There wasn't any progress to roll back. So this is an exciting time to try to start figuring out, what works, so that we can then, when there's a friendlier political situation, start to deploy what works. And that will hopefully have, not just benefits for the deforestation and hunger around the world, but for real humans living in the United States who have, I think, not been served by the current food and ag policies.
This clearly is an area that we can agree. I mean, I have been all over this country kind of looking at the innovation, looking at these new models of how you can, for lack of a better word, do regenerative kinds of practices, how you can do really creative kind of cover crops that will basically eliminate the need for nitrogen-based applications. There's just a lot that is really exciting that's going on right now. And as somebody who still has scars from the GMO movement, I will tell you that there will be a backlash in all of this. And the backlash won't come from the right. It won't come from farmers. It's going to come from people who don't believe that these practices will result in safe products. And so we have to be very clear that safety, food safety is our number one goal, but we also have to be willing to kind of think beyond what we're currently doing. Because what we're currently doing, when you said, what's going to change minds? What we're doing for American agriculture isn't working for American agriculture, right? So you've got this challenge that you have right now of this kind of policy debate and breach of trust between nutrition and farmers, and some farmers saying, nothing to see here, we'll put it all back together, we'll get a skinny farm bill. Bullshit. That won't happen because that trust has been breached, and unless you put it back and you put nutrition all back, you aren't going to put this back together. But what you might be able to do, I don't know if I shut this off, but what you might be able to do is actually have a conversation about what does the next 20 years in agriculture look like. And what's exciting about what you just said is that as we see farmers aging, guess who wants to be on the cutting edge of that technology? It's young farmers. It's people who are embracing kind of that change. And if you said, look, you can earn a living by utilizing just a small fraction of your input costs and utilizing a small fraction of your land, they're going to be okay with that. They're going to be okay with that. And so it's a matter of understanding the motivation, and it's not we want things the way they always were, because I think they understand, appreciate they're not going to be. But what does that look like, and how do you get early adapters? How do you encourage early adapters into that space so that it can motivate people? But I think more broadly, we have an incredible resource in rural America, but we have failing infrastructure, housing in particular. But we have failing infrastructure in terms of water and sewer, just the kinds of things that we need to grow population. And we're not focusing. We have an end-of-the-line problem in rural America. We always say this about the rural electrification movement. Why did it take so long? Well, it took so long because the last mile costs a lot. Getting that power down the road for a mile when you could do it in urban America, and you have 20 service lines on that same investment cost. And so we've got to solve the last mile problem in rural America. And I just want to put a plug in here that we have not talked about native populations and the land resources of native populations. And probably some of the most innovative entrepreneurial people I know are native people. I think there's a real opportunity to begin to model a lot of this kind of changes that we're talking about within a more receptive population to build those innovators, or to build that early adapters that will lead to, I think, people looking across the fence saying, hey, this working for him, I think I got to do this too.
All right, I want to leave time for audience questions. So raise your hand if you have a question in the room, and if you're online, please type a question in and we can read those out. In the back, over here, Robert.
Hi, my name's Robert Gordon. I'm with Georgetown. This is an awesome panel. Mike, it's a wonderful book. Senator, thank you for your service. I worked in the White House on a lot of things, but a little bit on agriculture in both the Biden administration and the Obama administration. I want to just second Mike's core analysis that there's you feel it when you're there. There's a high level of capture by a particular group, and it is peculiar because the group is no longer voting for either president, certainly not for President Biden. Normally we talk about capture, and at least the groups you're captured by are part of a winning coalition, and that is not what is happening here. And I think the conversation about changing the direction, finding ways to support rural America in new ways that are better for the climate, better for our health, better for the public, if there is a way to do that we can also bring more people along in your state, Senator, and you know it and I do not, that would be just fabulous. So wonderful conversation. I just want to bring up one group we haven't talked about very briefly, which is animals. I'd like to ask a little bit, I want to ask you each a question about animals. We have, 10 billion factory farm animals in America. They are treated in conditions of tremendous cruelty. I am curious, Senator, and I love honest answers on this. We subsidize that indirectly through the subsidies for commodity crops that enable very low-cost meat in this country. You can imagine a different system that wouldn't do that. I am curious, Senator, if you think there is a way to talk about that issue that does not sound effete, elite, urban, all the things that just do not appeal to people in rural America. And then, Mike, my question for you is, I think in your book, you have one path forward that's good for the climate and good for animals, and it's alt proteins. But short of that, it's really an argument for concentration, and that what is better for the climate is worse for animals. One of your Times articles is illustrated with an apartment building full of cows. And it seems like actually you unfortunately think that that's sort of, if we care about the climate, we got to do that, at least until all proteins arrives in a big way, which is far away. And I just wonder if you think I got that right, and if you have other ways to stop along the way.
Oh, yeah, I think that this is incredibly problematic because it cuts across culture, right? So it's like, now you're telling me I'm an animal abuser, right? And so I think, again, it's like, how do you bring a profitability discussion? So you look at eggs before, all of the challenges, cage-free eggs. They had a premium, but people were willing to pay it. And so you've got to figure out how you can change practices that will translate into a much higher value added on what they're doing. And so, number one, if farmers were sitting here and heard this, they would say, so now you're telling me come out and meet my cows, they're happy. They're out on the range, they're doing just fine. Thank you very much. Now, when they get to the feedlot, you can argue about whether but I got happy cows out there. So quit bitching at me, and guess what? I'm out there and 20 degrees below zero in the middle of a blizzard feeding them. So don't tell me I abuse my cows. And so I think it's about language on the front end, and then it's about profitability. And if you can make those translations, you can have a conversation. But again, if you said a trigger point, the kind of, PETA hating kind of, trust me, I've been at feedlots where, there was counter protests from the ranchers.
It's also true that there are a lot of environmental consequences of CAFOs, and CAFOs were largely responsible for zoning a lot of the Midwest. So rural communities aren't necessarily in favor of...
Well, and they don't bring the level of employment that people... So they bring no one likes driving by a confined hog operation. Trust me. I don't know how many of you have ever been out there, but it's not, where I grew up, there was some of the beginning of the confinement, and so everybody understands that that's not necessarily good. Chickens. Trust me, we had an egg facility in Devil's Lake that was abandoned, and literally the walls of the structure were eaten by the remains, the toxicity, and the kind of level of corrosiveness of the remains that were there. And so people see that and they say, that doesn't look good. And there is a little bit of the NIMBY in rural America. They don't want these things next to them. They don't want to hear about how they abuse animals, but they don't want to smell it every day.
When you take first of all, this is hard, right? On the one hand, when I say agriculture is eating the earth, 3/4 of agricultural land is supporting livestock. It's about 2/3 of it is pasture, and the rest of it is crops that we feed to livestock. And then on the other hand, I interview a pollster in the book who tells me that like restrictions on meat or taxes or anything basically having to do with meat are the least popular policies he has ever polled. His joke was that it's like up there with veterans benefits for ISIS. Which is a way to say like I don't think you want to lead with your chin on this necessarily. And I would say that you are partly right in that there is often, other than alternative proteins, which, despite I kind of chronicle at least the boom and the bust. I wouldn't call it the rise and the fall because I'm still bullish, so to speak, about their future. And that is, that's obviously a win for animals and a win for the environment and the climate and for people who care about pandemics and antibiotic use and every other problem with animal agriculture. It is true that there is often, like beef is about 10 times worse than chicken from a land use and climate perspective. But actually, cows are treated a lot better than chickens, even in feedlots.
They're happy.
Yeah, well, they actually, there's a funny. If you read the book, I did visit a cattle feedlot, and they weren't Bellerin, as the guy said, but chickens do get treated like shit, and there is an absolute trade-off there. I guess partly, I'm sort of trying to make people aware of the trade-offs at least. Now, when it comes to the kind of regenerative versus, sort of how these it is true that conventional beef is like way better for the climate than grass-fed beef. But I did visit in Brazil. There's a scene where I visit a sort of corn, soy, beef operation, massive, and it's run by a farmer who has definitely not read Michael Pollan, and did not give a damn about the environment. But he was doing a lot of regenerative practices. He had rotational grazing. He was integrating his crops with his livestock. He was also fertilizing his pastures and then sending he had a feedlot, stuff that Michael Pollan wouldn't like. But the main point was that he was getting kick-ass yields. And so he was, 10 times as much of his neighbors, which meant he was using 1/10 as much of the Amazon. And so again, to the extent that better animal treatment, my feedlot guy who I spent some time with, he talks about how it's very inefficient to mistreat cattle because they don't produce as well. And certainly you hear that all the time from the dairy industry. Happy cows make more milk. Again, I think I'm aware of the trade-offs, but I think essentially what we should be pushing for is you kind of pick your priority and then you push for, to the extent that 99% of our meat comes from factory farms, we want them to treat the animals a little better and do it with a little bit less mess. And I think hopefully, that can both be part of the progressive conversation.
I'm going to look over at Sophie. Do we have any questions coming in online?
Yes, we have a question about consolidation in the agriculture sector and how can policy help both farmers and rural residents who are frustrated with this consolidation that is hollowing out their communities.
I think we need to figure out if it's the secondary consolidation, which is in animal processing. We have so few processors in America that adds to the concentration of animal units in smaller units. And the one thing, there isn't diversity of taste. I mean, everybody kind of forgets this. These animals are they have been highly curated genetically, especially beef. And so there is a market for a kind of common product that leads to concentration, and it also leads to lower cost. And so one of the things that I would say is that there is this challenge that you have between food safety and concentration, because having a lot of little butcher shops, which used to be the norm in rural America, but they are I would tell you, over-regulated. Inspectors in each one when you probably wouldn't need that. And so I think there's ways to look at, antitrust and antitrust enforcement and what needs to happen in terms of input costs, what needs to happen in terms of who you're selling to and concentration in who you're selling to. But you also need to have a discussion about regulation on each one of those ends. And to me, we spend a lot of time talking about, in the progressive movement about antitrust and eliminating concentration, not subsidizing, big is better. Sonny Perdue famously said, I think in Wisconsin, go big, get big or get out. And that's been kind of a policy mantra that a lot of people are attacking. That's what's wrong with farm policy. But I think we also need to look at why it is that where we haven't had concentration in the past, we have more concentration today. And I think it is who's buying your product, and I think it also is who can afford the kind of safety regulations that go with it, and is there a better way to do that?
I'm going to jump in. I mean, I think I'm partly trying to make a general case for that, farmers should be treated like other businesses, and so that means sort of maybe throwing less money at them, regulating them, more seriously. But on something like this, I feel like this is something where I've been accused of just being I'm the shill for big ag, because often it is true that big ag is often efficient, but and I am somewhat of a shill for efficiency, but especially on the input side, I think it's that these farmers having to deal with cartels is that's a tough problem, that they have to buy their seeds and their fertilizer and and their pesticides from and then dealing with the meat packers and dealing with these are real problems, and I think that's a legitimate that's a sort of legitimate concern. I think it's from a production standpoint. I think the idea of making more food with less land can work. I'm for whoever can do that. Whether it's and with less mess. But I think it's a fair concern that farmers have.
All right, I'm going to suggest we have time for a lightning round. Very last question from the audience, if anyone. Yes.
Totally Republican, the farm culture, and then how do we increase the income, so to speak, in rural, improve the economy? Let's look to clean energy. North Dakota, one of the biggest wind states, putting money into farmers' pockets as well as into real estate taxes, into the communities, paying for schools and such. If we look at agrivoltaics, Senator, to what extent do the farmers who are, and the communities that are earning money from all this wind, are they less red? Are they recognizing what the Republican Party is doing to their potential futures or to their income spaces? And Michael, do you see this as a bridge space? For example, photovoltaics, if we do agrivoltaics, I can power an EV 70 times as far off that electricity than I can from the ethanol off an acre of corn.
In answer in 30 seconds.
Of the future.
I can. This is really problematic, and how I argue this is that it's private property rights. Who the hell are you to tell me I can't put a solar farm on my land? Who the hell are you to tell me that I can't put windmills on my land? But there is so much pressure from the kind of cultural, political standpoint of fossil fuels that it has literally shut down the development of renewables and all of the false narratives that are out there on renewables. I think that the problem is that we've argued this from a climate standpoint and not from a private property rights standpoint. And everybody hates regulation until you're regulating something you don't like, right? And so I think we need to change the narrative. A great example of this is what's happened with the Grain Belt line. And if you haven't been paying attention, Grain Belt line's carrying a lot of renewable electricity in Illinois, Missouri. Missouri doesn't like it. Farmers don't like it. Trump pulled the loan guarantees because it was carrying renewable energy as opposed to other kinds of energy.
I totally agree, and I think that this is, and it's the unfortunate thing is that in probably everything in agriculture and everything in America has become a culture war. And so, windmills, as the president calls them, and solar panels, they're just, it's sort of like, which side are you on? It's hard to have in the same way that alternative proteins and electric vehicles became like that. And it's tough. And honestly, right now, only one side is fighting in rural America.
Well, I want to thank Mike and Heidi for showing up. It went fast. And hopefully we started chipping away at some of these hard questions. Certainly didn't solve the debate. But thank you so much for being here.